more efficient in its operations, and more diverse in the composition of its workforce, reflecting the growing diversity of the wider society. Critically, it concluded that government administration was excessively centralised and excessively hierarchical. It recommended greater devolution of management authority of service delivery, including the idea of one-stop shops for citizens to access a range of services in the one place. It found, and I quote, "Better decisions will be made and better service given to people if authority and responsibility are devolved to officials close to where the action occurs." In that idea lies the foundation of our modern decentralised public service. The great themes of the Coombs report were reflected in a decade and a half of reform from the early 1980s onwards. The public servants of that era, John Paterson among them, undertook a fundamental rethink of what government should do and how it should go about doing it. In difficult economic times, they helped to internationalise the Australian economy and to move beyond the policy complacency of previous decades. They were partners in a long-term reform agenda, whose central organising principle was the enhancement of Australia's global competitiveness. Within the ranks of the public service, they forced their colleagues to focus on efficiency, transparency and accountability of government, because taxpayer dollars were scarce, and economic reform also meant the reform of government itself. They were modernisers. They had to be. There was no turning back. In those years, all the major legislation governing the public service, some of it dating back to the earliest years of federation, was completely rewritten. The budgetary, structural and other public service reforms of the 1980s and 1990s were as large in their time as those of the post-war Reconstruction generation. They helped to produce Australia's long period of economic growth, and they positioned us well for the challenge of the global economic crisis. These were also the years when Coombs' vision of a more diverse public service, more representative of the Australian population, began to be realised. For example, in 1999, women outnumbered men for the first time and today account for nearly 58% of the APS. More than 1 in 3 members of the senior executive service is female, and while we have further to go, that proportion is rising. That is just one example of how the APS has continued to change and evolve to meet the needs of its time. Today, the APS again confronts a changing world and the need to prepare for these future challenges. I do not believe that changes require a revolution. Instead, the APS requires continuing reform. As the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Terry Moran, has said in a recent speech, the APS is not broken, it is not a renovator's opportunity. Cast your eyes across the governments of the world and consider the quality of public administration that has been achieved by Australia across the 108-year history of the Australian public service. It is not completely without fault or failure, but any fair-minded person would agree that Australia has been remarkably well served by the Australian public service and has been remarkably stable, remarkably impartial and remarkably free from corruption. It is no surprise that a British report last year reported that 87% of Australian citizens expressed satisfaction with federal government services, or that the same report listed our public services third in our long list of similar countries ahead of Canada, New Zealand, the US and the UK for its independence from political interference and its capacity to give impartial advice. Likewise, an assessment of the quality of e-government services and products of 192 UN member states in 2008 ranked Australia 8th in the world. These are impressive results for a comparatively lean public service of 160,000 employees, or just 1.5% of the Australian workforce. But in the face of the challenges facing us in the decade ahead, it is not enough for us to say that the APS is doing a good job and therefore the status quo is fine. It never is. In my address to the Senior Executive Service in April 2008, I spoke of the need to develop a culture of policy innovation and to enhance the strategic policy capability of the APS. This means becoming more creative, not just reactive. It means the APS being bolder in its thinking and doing more to consider the big picture, transformational policy change, not just piecemeal reform. It means strengthening the APS's ability to deliver high-quality services and linking policy creation more closely to program implementation, so that lessons learnt on the front line of service delivery feed back into the agencies that formulate policy. That public servants, from portfolio secretaries in Canberra to frontline workers in Centrelink, work tirelessly to put the citizen at the heart of everything, repeat, everything they do. And critically, that the APS does more to attract, train and retain the very best of people. The APS must have its proper share of the nation's most talented people, because, as I said last year to the SES, the challenges facing government are as tough, intellectually demanding and important for our nation's future as the challenges facing any of our business or non-profit organisations. It is the view of the government and the heads of the APS that only by hiring and promoting the best people can we solve the great challenges of our time. From health reform to the education revolution, from our climate change strategy to dealing with national security threats, from tackling Indigenous disadvantage to building a globally competitive 21st century economy. We are facing challenges so complex in their causes, so shifting in their natures, so contentious in the arguments they provoke and so radical in the solutions they demand that they cannot be addressed with business as usual thinking. Some social scientists have coined the term wicked problems to describe these challenges. However, as a former member of the APS, I know that public servants don't believe in wickedness. Instead, I suspect they are more comfortable with what might be called systemic challenges, challenges that might even call for courageous policies. Whatever the label, these challenges often have these dimensions. First, they emerge from external factors that are often global in scope. Second, they require not just policy change from government and the public service, but often behavioural change from the economy, society and individuals. Third, these policies must be implemented comprehensively in complex and changing circumstances so that policy implementation is seen as important as policy innovation. Fourth, these challenges must be tackled under full media spotlight. And fifth, given the present economic crisis and the need for sustained fiscal discipline, they must be tackled in a context of constrained resources. And to restate this theme of this conference, they require governments and public services to govern, manage and reform in times of crisis. What Alan Fels has called high-velocity environments. Such problems defy conventional approaches. They require new collaborative approaches to policy making across departments, across Commonwealth, state, territory and local governments. They often require partnerships with the private sector and with the community sector. Increasingly, they also require us to work with governments abroad, not simply through the agencies of foreign policy, but across every arm of policy in what would hitherto be described as the exclusive preserve of domestic policy. Above all, they require innovative, urgent and practical policy thinking. Great ideas, but also ideas grounded in the real world. These are the profound challenges that face the Australian public service. But I believe the APS has the capacity to meet them. Based on what I've seen as Prime Minister and what I know of Australian history, I have every confidence in the ability of the APS to address them. Consider the challenges we have confronted since the global financial crisis escalated so dramatically 1 year ago this month. Australia has weathered the global recession better than most other countries. Australia, unlike every other major advanced economy to date, has not fallen into technical recession. In fact, Australia is the only advanced economy to have reported positive growth over the past year. Part of Australia's resilience is due to the success of our policy response. We acted early and decisively across a range of policy levers to strengthen the banking system and to support activity in the real economy. Australia was one of the first countries in the world to announce a bank guarantee. Australia rapidly implemented a comprehensive government stimulus package that will save over 2,000 jobs over the next 2 years, 200,000 jobs over the next 2 years. Overall, the government's response to the global economic crisis has so far been positive in terms of early problem diagnosis and management, in terms of rapid and creative policy response, and in the context of the enormous complexity of policy implementation in a very short period of time. On all three fronts, many challenges still lie ahead, but so far the APS has performed remarkably well. The Australian and many overseas governments worked together through the G20. Federal and state governments worked together. Public service agencies worked together. Staff put in long hours together. Multiple challenges were managed simultaneously. The threat of global financial institutions collapsing, credit markets failing, the private economy grinding to a halt. These have not been insignificant challenges. This has been a test of crisis management, and so far the APS has performed extraordinarily well. When we needed to make decisions swiftly, the APS was able to deliver first-class advice within very short timeframes. And when we needed to create a new structure of Commonwealth and state coordinators for the implementation of the Nation Building for Recovery programs, the APS delivered, although the rollout will continue to be challenging given its scope and given its urgency. Their task was to work swiftly, work across traditional departmental boundaries, and to work together and to make sure the job got done. And they are getting the job done. More than 30,000 infrastructure projects worth more than $20 billion have been approved. Construction work has begun at more than 5,000 schools, and we expect every Australian primary school to have new infrastructure by 2011. Construction has begun on nearly 1,000 new community and defence homes, and we expect at least 15,000 homes to be built by the end of next year. Through the work on the Nation Building Plan, I've seen a public service filled with capable and committed individuals able to perform under intense pressure, and I thank the public service for that. The government I lead came to office committed to renewing the movement for reform, while at the same time maintaining the continuity that is among the great strengths of the APS. We removed no departmental heads. There was no night of the long knives. But we believe that over the preceding decade, the critical lines between politics on the one hand and the public service on the other had at times become blurred, and we've set out to restore them. We've made merit-based selection mandatory for most agency heads and statutory office holders. In conjunction with senior public servants, we held induction sessions for incoming ministerial staff on the roles and responsibilities of the public service. We introduced a code of conduct for ministerial staff that sets out standards of professionalism, integrity and behaviour, including in their relationships with public servants. We introduced new guidelines for government advertising campaigns so that no advertising campaign worth more than $250,000 can proceed without a report from the Auditor-General. We've introduced legislation abolishing conclusive certificates under the Freedom of Information Act 1982 and the Archives Act 1983. We've introduced a register of lobbyists for the first time in the Commonwealth to regulate contact between third-party lobbyists and government representatives, including ministers, staff, public servants and defence personnel. Our Government 2.0 task force is also looking at ways to use information technology to build a pro-disclosure culture within the public service. These were the first steps in our plan to reinvigorate the Westminster tradition in an Australian setting. But the larger challenges still lie ahead, and that is to move forward with the vision to make the APS the best public service anywhere in the world. That should be our galvanising vision. I believe that is an entirely reasonable and achievable aspiration for the Australian public service if we take the right actions now. To achieve that goal, I believe the APS must perform 5 tasks. 1, provide high-quality, forward-looking, creative policy advice in a rapidly changing policy environment. 2, to deliver high-quality programs and services that put the citizen first. 3, maintaining a culture of honesty, impartiality and fairness with a focus on retaining public trust. 4, provide flexible, agile responses to changing realities and government priorities. And 5, to be effective and efficient in all its operations. We have a strong APS, but much needs to be done to achieve these objectives. First, while the APS ranks highly in global terms for providing independent and impartial advice, we must ensure that this advice is also creative, innovative and outward-looking. Public servants should not be shy about big ideas or be afraid to be bold. As I've said before, we cannot afford a culture where the public service only tells government what it wants to hear. Over time, the APS has begun to create policy through task forces and teams that are formed not from single divisions or departments, but include policymakers from across government and from the private sector, and from the